Good afternoon. The topic for session 4 is model acceptance and model sharing for regulatory use. We have 4 speakers for this session. The first speaker, Dr. Andrew Babiskin, holds the position of team leader for the locally acting PBPK modeling team in the Division of Quantitative Methods and Modeling, Office of Research and Standards, OGD. Dr. Babiskin's current work focuses on advancing mechanistic-based absorption modeling of locally acting complex products to develop support novel in vitro and in vivo pharmacokinetic-based methods to establish bioequivalence. The second speaker, Dr. Peck, is an adjunct professor at UCSF. He is a co-founder and expert consultant of NDA Partners ProPharma. His career-long interest in quantitative clinical pharmacology is expressed in more than 175 published peer-reviewed papers and chapters. As a former director of the FDA Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, CDER, he championed incorporation of advanced quantitative clinical pharmacology approaches in regulatory science and medical product development. The third speaker, Dr. Liang Zhao, is the Director of Division of Quantitative Methods and Modeling, Office of Research and Standards, OGD. Dr. Zhao, through his 16-year professional career, he has established his leadership in industrial R&D, quantitative methods and modeling, and model-based strategic decision-making in regulatory and industrial settings for generic and new drugs. The fourth speaker, Dr. Amin Rostami-Hodjegan, is a professor of system pharmacology and the director of the Center for Applied Pharmacokinetic Research at the University of Manchester. In addition, Dr. Rostami is the Senior Vice President of Research and Development and the Chief Scientific Officer at Certara. As a leader in the field of PBPK and QSP, Amin is internationally recognized for his expertise in the use of in vitro information to predict the behavior of drug in human body and associated inter-individual variabilities. Following the 4 presentations, there will be a panel discussion. The moderators for the panel discussion are Dr. Liang Zhao and Dr. Donna Major. Dr. Major is a professor and vice chair of pharmaceutical sciences at the University of Buffalo State University of New York. He is the president and CEO of Enhanced Pharmacodynamics. His research focuses on identifying molecular and physiological factors that control the pharmacological properties of drugs by combining experimental data with pharmacometrics and system pharmacology, with a focus on anti-cancer and immunomodulatory agents. Now let's turn the floor to the speakers.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Babiskin, and I will be delivering the first presentation for the session titled Model Acceptance and Model Sharing for Regulatory Use. Today, I will be providing a regulatory perspective on challenges and opportunities to enhance model sharing upon regulatory use. Before I jump into the meat of my presentation, I just want to give the standard disclaimer to make it clear that this presentation only reflects my views and should not be construed to represent FDA's views or policies. I also want to make it clear that this presentation and the ideas contained within are really from my own perspective through my time at the FDA, through assessing different ANDA and pre-ANDA submissions. Before we get into the model sharing aspects, we're going to take a bit of a detour through my experience and observations with mechanistic models submitted in ANDAs for bioequivalence purposes. This will help establish the challenges and questions that have arisen that have ultimately led to us having this symposium dedicated to model sharing. The next couple of slides will describe what I have observed in submissions and pre-ANDA packages since 2016, where we have seen increasing activity year to year. As part of the Division of Quantitative Methods and Modeling, we are routinely consulted by the Office of Bioequivalence when such modeling packages get submitted, where we utilize our subject matter expertise to evaluate how appropriate the model-based approach is and the credibility of the approach being used. Of the total ANDAs submitted with mechanistic models for bioequivalence, about half of them are related to metered dose inhalers. 40% are for oral drug products and 10% for topical products. This may come to a surprise to many, as we would expect more adoption for oral products given the longer history of PBK for these products. But these numbers may be more a reflection for which areas there is more interest in the alternative bioequivalence pathway. Within ANDA submissions, we have seen a diverse range of model types that have been employed. Starting with the most prevalent, it goes oral PBK, then inhalation CFD, then inhalation PBK modeling, the PBKs in quotes to capture also some of the semi-mechanistic Carmelo model-based approaches that we've seen, then inhalation semi-empirical regional deposition modeling, then inhalation aerosol evaporation modeling, and lastly, dermal PBK modeling. We have also seen differences in when the modeling is employed/developed within the application. Half the time, the modeling is ad hoc, or in other words, is being developed during product development to be integrated in an overall bioequivalence approach. The other half of the time, we have seen that modeling has been developed post hoc, usually to address deficiencies/issues in pivotal bioequivalence studies or to address changes in product-specific guidance. In the ANDA submitted models, we have also seen applicants utilizing both commercial and in-house modeling packages. When it comes to oral and dermal PBK and the semi-empirical regional deposition modeling, we have mostly seen commercial software utilized. For inhalation PBK, these have been in-house developed coding. For CFD, we have seen both types of software utilized. We've also observed some consistent theme/purpose for the model, which follows closely with what I had outlined for ad hoc versus post hoc modeling development. Models are being developed to address study aberrations, support not conducting follow-up studies, and support alternative BE approaches. Through all these cases, I would like to draw your attention to a successful case example of a dermal ANDA that utilized dermal PBK to support an alternative BE pathway and gain regulatory approval. This case was discussed in yesterday's dermal modeling session, but I will again point everyone to check out our CPT PSP review article on this case. The citation is provided on this slide. Moving on from ANDA submissions, we have seen a plethora of pre-ANDA packages and control correspondences proposing mechanistic modeling. Like with the ANDAs, we have seen cases where the modeling is employed to support an alternative BE approach, which includes not conducting certain in vivo pharmacokinetic or comparative clinical endpoint BE studies, to address challenges related to the comparison of in vitro BE study results, and even to validate new clinical endpoints. Within the pre-ANDAs, we have seen the majority of the activity in the dermal and inhalation space, but I've also seen packages for implants, ocular products, and complex injectables. In all, we see even greater diversity of modeling approaches that we anticipate will eventually come to the ANDA stage. Given the variety of the types of models employed and their purposes, we have found that there are some commonalities in how these models are assessed from the regulatory side that I would like to share today. Particularly when it comes to these locally acting models where data is limited when it comes to validating/verifying across local tissue concentration, the quality of the data is an important consideration. Then we consider whether or not the justifications are scientifically sound. Is the parameter selection and optimization appropriate? Have all relevant processes been considered with special emphasis on absorption aspects for these bioequivalence approaches? Are test and reference products adequately defined in the model? How will they ultimately be compared? How well is the PK data being predicted for the product of interest, but also how well is the platform performing for a larger array of products? Internally, we also do our due diligence and look at whether there is additional data available for validation and for assessing the model. Lastly, we also consider the usage of virtual healthy or patient populations when it comes to either assessing virtual bioequivalence or for model validation. We have also observed several issues in the submitted models, some of which I will highlight today. We have seen models that are submitted but without a clearly defined purpose, which then complicates regulatory assessment. We see simulation results that are presented but without any interpretation or analysis. We see either inadequate or no model verification and validation activities. This includes models that are developed only off of the reference product or just off the reference and test products, which then limits the ability to demonstrate that the model can predict cases which would not be BE. We see repurposed models from literature without much consideration for the applicability of that repurposing, and sometimes an over-reliance for commercial platforms that may have been built for different purposes or without a history of published case studies. Structurally, we have seen a lack of complete integration of the modeling approach with the rest of the ANDA, where sometimes model assumptions or input have conflicted with other parts of the ANDA submission. A lot of these specific challenges all relate to a concept we have titled Platform Performance Assessment. The modeling platform itself for PBPK is a series of equations and parameters that describe ADME processes defined by anatomy and physiology. The platform is what you will use to develop your product-specific model, but its credibility, the platform credibility, is independent of your specific case. Rather, we have typically considered platform credibility to be based on whether a sufficient number of diverse products can accurately be predicted given the intended purpose of the model. With now platform performance assessment defined, and with understanding of the critical role it plays in ensuring successful regulatory decision-making, I propose in this slide some critical questions that can come up for all stakeholders when they face how to address this within an ANDA. Who is the responsible party? It may seem like a basic question, but there are complexities as it relates to this question as we consider three major stakeholders for the platform/model. The platform developer, if separate from the applicant, for example, a commercial software developer, the applicant itself, and the FDA or other regulatory body. For the platform developer, are they developing the platform for a specific purpose? In other words, a ready-made solution that they're selling. Or are they just developing a framework from which other parties can use and or modify and verify for their own purposes? For the applicant, consideration should be made whether that commercial or published model is ready to use off the shelf. Based on the level of evidence out there or the intended purpose of that model, consideration would have to be made in regard to additional V&V activities to be undertaken. Even then, a question that may need to be asked and may be unknown is the level of confidence the FDA already has in the use of the platform for that specific intended purpose. For the FDA, we had to face questions of how often the platform performance assessment would need to be carried out externally and internally, but also how much when we're doing activity internally, how much knowledge should be leveraged when assessing this platform. In other words, does the data requirements change with time as we see more and more cases? Now let's reconsider the previous slide against a hypothetical but realistic case, a commercial platform developed for toxicology safety assessments of orally inhaled compounds repurposed for bioequivalence comparison and regional deposition. The applicability of a platform is closely tied to the intended purpose of the model, as the model risk and decision consequence depends on that purpose. V&V for toxicology applications may not be sufficient for bioequivalence applications. The type of data needed for V&V could also be different depending on the application. And even more importantly, does the platform contain the right inputs to properly define the test and reference formulations for your now repurposed application? The applicant should consider whether the platform was built for the purposes they need, and if so, whether or not the documentation exists to provide to the FDA supporting that purpose. If not, the applicant may have to consider performing their own platform verification. Unless already communicated publicly, the assumption cannot be that FDA has already assessed this platform, nor that the FDA even has direct access to it. For the FDA, once we receive the platform assessment package, let's assume that we already have past experience with the platform and believe it to be credible for the given purpose. Does the platform assessment have to be done again? Should internal cases be leveraged for additional assessment of the platform? While these are positive activities, it creates a risk for the applicant if this previous history or cases are unknown to them, and that will create uncertainty on what to submit. With model sharing, it may be possible to resolve some of the issues mentioned previously and remove some of those question marks we have. I think every party wants to optimize time and resources. Applicants don't want to submit or perform work on information that may not be necessary for ANDA assessment, and the FDA doesn't want to assess the same packages over and over again. If we can consider a case where the FDA has already established confidence in a particular platform for a specific purpose and has already been communicated externally, should subsequent applications with that platform need to perform reassessment or re-verification? The hope is that the answer would be no, though there may be times where new verification activities are needed, say for incremental version update of the software or for a drug substance that falls out of the platform verification data set. Outside the applicant, we could envision a situation with model sharing where, independent of the applicant, a model developer can directly send platform verification information to the FDA. This could be particularly useful if platform development occurred with proprietary data that is not shared with typical users. At the end of the day, it is critical that every stakeholder with the model, including the regulatory bodies, have detailed information about the development and verification of the platform, particularly if that platform is going to be utilized to support bringing a product to market. Restricting such information between parties makes regulatory acceptance that much harder to achieve. While we all can benefit from model sharing, we do have to acknowledge and discuss some fundamental challenges that can arise to reach this more idealized state. We would have to consider how to access data if it is siloed off in multiple separate entities, particularly if that data can be critical for regulatory acceptance. And once a platform or model is shared, what would need to be included in subsequent uses? Where can the model or platform be shared and accessible to all users? We also have to consider implications of versioning for both the models and the platform. Lastly, there are some final holistic points I would like to make for today's discussion, particularly when thinking about mechanistic models. These are really just reflections of reality, and the models/platforms themselves are knowledge bases. Knowledge in science is universal and not the domain of a single entity. Sharing of knowledge, such as these models, is how we move this technology forward and have faster adoption, and then we can see greater presence in regulatory decision making. At the end of the day, our goals, I would assume, are aligned. We're trying to achieve faster product development time, reduce development costs, and reduce clinical testing in human subjects. I appreciate everyone listening to this presentation today, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Good afternoon. This is Carl Peck, checking in from the Central Coast of California. It's a pleasure to join you this afternoon. I'm grateful to Liang, Zhao, and his colleagues for inviting me to share my views on the subject challenges and opportunities to enhance model sharing upon regulatory use, non-regulatory perspective. As for conflicts of interest, I am a consultant for ND Partners, a pro-pharma company. I unashamedly champion modeling and simulation to every product developer and regulatory scientist that I run into. And I'm a member of a research team that is exploring alternative statistical models for evaluation of bioequivalence and comparative bioavailability data. So what kind of models are we talking about? I understand that this symposium has a focus on complex generics and the use of modeling in the regulation and development of complex generics, but I've taken a broader view and will be commenting on, in general, the use of pharmacokinetic models, whether they be compartmental or my favorite, physiologically based PK and PKD models, PD models, exposure response models, disease models, and statistical models. So from a non-regulatory perspective, that is a sponsor developing a new medical product, why use a model? Well, the potential benefits that may be at hand include a shorter development time, more efficient development efforts, that is fewer clinical trials, lower cost, facilitation of communications with the agency, and increased potential for approval. Nonetheless, there are perceived potential barriers, such as lack of understanding of modeling and its value, lack of expertise for implementation, longer development times, greater resource requirements and cost, and uncertainty as to the potential for a successful approval. So in considering non-regulatory perspectives with respect to challenges and opportunities for the application of modeling for complex generics, it occurred to me that we should perhaps look at precedents. Now, one precedent that might not immediately come to mind is the application of the 2 one-sided t-test, or TOAST, for bioequivalence approval. This is hands down the most widely shared and the most successful application of a shared model for the development and approval of a medical product. It's a statistical model, a statistical hypothesis testing model. I also recall that the Division of Pharmacometrics in Seizure had a program for disease models. And so I queried Yanning Wang and Hao Xu, who shared with me very interesting history and development of these models. As you will see on the next slide in a moment, there have been 16 disease models developed. And the utilization, the utilities of these have included dosage optimization, trial design, features, extrapolations across populations, and so forth. There are at least 14 related publications, and I'm about to show a slide that's unreadable, but if you look at it carefully, you'll be able to access those references. Now, an example application that Hao Xu shared was the use of disease models for schizophrenia, bipolar I disorder, and partial onset seizure, which can be and have been used to support efficacy findings in adults that can be directly extrapolated into pediatric patients, so-called mapping of benefit in adults to children for pediatric dosing. This can be undertaken without undertaking a clinical efficacy trial in children. I cite on this slide a guidance that supports this: drugs for treatment of partial onset seizures, full extrapolation of efficacy from adults to pediatric patients. Here you see a listing of these 16 models that have been vetted by FDA and are available for use by drug developers. They've been applied to cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's disease, human immunovirus, HIV, schizophrenia, bipolar, weight loss, pulmonary hypertension, and seizures. As promised, in this slide you see all 14 of the publications that have been released explaining 14 of the 16 models and their applications. So I end by trying to answer the query that was posed to me as a topic for this presentation. So what are the challenges in sharing and using models? Well, the first challenge is having sufficient modeling expertise and understanding of the value of models of both the FDA and the sponsor. Understanding the value of models is a particularly big challenge in companies. I work primarily with early stage companies where the funding is tight, the timeline for realization of value of the investment is short, and the personnel are largely from academia or from investor groups, and their level of understanding is a work in progress for sure. Second challenge is the willingness of sponsors to take this route as opposed to a more traditional one. There are perceived risks of failure and competition, worry about cost in dollars and in time. And finally, encouraging all parts of FDA to champion and be receptive to modeling for product development. So what then are the opportunities to enhance model sharing? Well, one is recruitment of knowledgeable staffs for both sponsors, drug developers, and FDA. Second is education of sponsors and FDA decision makers. Thirdly, promotion and encouragement and championship of employing shared models. It's particularly important to have published examples of successful shared models and to further develop procedures and initiatives that have been shown to be successful in this domain. For example, the end of phase 2A meetings, the model-informed and the complex innovative designs pilot programs. So there you have my consideration of this topic. What are the non-regulatory perspectives with respect to challenges and opportunities to enhance model sharing upon regulatory use? Thank you for your attention, and I greatly look forward to the panel discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Liang Zhao. I'm here to share some personal view on what is a model master file and how it can be shared. Disclaimer: this presentation reflects the views of the author and should not be construed to represent FDA's view or policies. The presenter is offering his perspective based upon his experiences during regulatory decision-making. Before we talk about a model master file, let's take a quick look at the drug master file and potentially appreciate some similarities in terms of use and characteristics. Out of its definition and many features, we can tell that a drug master file allows parties to reference material without disclosing DMF contents to those parties. It resembles some of the PBPK modules developed for dermal and ophthalmic drug delivery models, where the details of all physiological parameters and a part of the dynamic setups may not be fully visible to the drug applicants or sponsors. Similar to DMFs, models are not required by statute or regulation, and neither approved nor disapproved. Like DMFs, models only provide technical support for the approval of a product. Like DMFs, models can assume different types depending on their use and the corresponding regulatory impacts. For example, there are models for virtual bee simulations, models for mechanistic AV-AVC, and models to characterize AV-RT and AV-PT results. DMFs and models do share some common characteristics. The same model can certainly be used by one or more applicants or sponsors without disclosing its technical details and platform qualifications, especially for PBPK modeling. Models in general are also reviewed in connection with the review of applications that reference them. For accepted models, like DMFs, they do not need to be re-reviewed for subsequent applications unless the model has been modified to a certain extent. Although models may not involve, strictly speaking, the proprietary information, there are potential intellectual properties and technical expertise that sometimes be protected from the developers. For example, NAMM is known for its flexibility to feed data out of complicated scenarios where other software packages using the same model of data may have failed. If there were not an open source package, NAMM developer might have chosen not to share the computational nuances behind the non-intuitive Fortran codes for commercial interest. Why do we want to officialize the concept of model sharing in the form of model master file? First, it by nature can serve as a communication tool that will bring public awareness on utilities of the relevant models, regulatory acceptance on certain models, and the steps to verify and validate a model for regulatory use. It can certainly have a cost saving by recycling models to serve the same regulatory purpose and reduce duplication of effort from both industry and the agency. It can support the standardization of model building, model verification, and validation. Sometimes non-proprietary data that accompany with the model will be simultaneously shared when situation allows. Applicants or the agency may not collect or review the same data repetitively. The model master files can communicate the current status quo of particular model developments and serve as the benchmarks for further model advancements. Finally, the quantified pharmacology and physiology knowledge can be shared along with the model to overcome common challenges. Not every type of model would need a model master file to be shared. Certainly, we may not want to give rise to unnecessary bureaucracy here. Generally, models with challenging to get proprietary information and or that need a large data set from other sources to verify and validate may benefit from having master files. These models can include, but not limited to, PBPK, systems pharmacology, mechanistic AVC models, or other types of mechanistic models. I'll give more details in the next slides. In contrast, models that can be easily duplicated from scientific publications may not necessarily need master files. They can be population PK models, explorer response analysis, and many conventional PK/PD models. As Dr. Carl Peck will mention, the TOAST approach for B assessment can be mathematical approach that do not need a model master file. As mentioned, some mechanistic models can benefit from having model master files. They can be either commercial or in-house modeling packages, as presented by Dr. Andrew Babiskin earlier. The example mechanistic models can be commercially developed oral and dermal PBPK and inhalation as ERDM, in-house developed inhalation PBPK or compartment-based models, or computational fluid dynamics models that have been developed either commercially or in-house. These mechanistic models can be of a variety of regulatory utilities, including addressing aberrations in bee studies, weaving follow-up studies, and or serving as a replacement of comparative clinical endpoint bee studies. One prominent example of regulatory use goes to the approval of diclofenac topical gel, where virtual bee simulations have been used in lieu of a clinical endpoint study for the first generic approval. For model master file, given that it is the new concept that's brought up in this meeting, the first question to ask is what elements would justify a model master file? From personal view, a model master file can have the following characteristics. The model in the master file must have explicit regulatory purpose and has received regulatory acceptance for the purpose. The model must include all technical details that can allow a duplication of the practice. The technical components must include relevant data to support the model, the software, and or the platform to run the model, steps for model building, the model verification and validation processes, and the results, and the simulation results. It must include modeling simulation practices that can be duplicated, cross-referenced, and inter-extrapolated within the scientific scope of use. To realize the value of any new physical product, marketing and distribution will be needed to get it into the hands of customers. Similarly, with the new model master file, we must also bring the awareness of its existence and use to relevant stakeholders and find an entity who can distribute it. The entities can be the agency, the pharmaceutical industry, a consulting firm, a journal, or dedicated function or potential organization, such as a modeling-focused scientific association. The model master file holders can be different from the model master file developers if situation allows. A side question will be the involvement of a fee to use the model master file. I will leave to the panel to further discuss the question, but would assume the coexistence of free open access and pay for service options. What will be the sharing mechanisms for model master file? Conventionally, depending on the nature of a model master file, models can be shared through relevant conferences, publications, online scientific communities, or consulting services. Looking into the future, I would also welcome the panel's considerations on potential venues ranging from review documentations, agency-sponsored website database, dedicated journal subsection, consortium, to an organization-sponsored database. A new thing or phenomenon would always come with a new ecosystem. In the new ecosystem that will emerge with model master files, potential questions for the panel to consider include partial content sharing, how to deal with the proprietary information, potential legal implications, and a commercial interest accommodation. Finally, I would propose the following questions to be discussed in the panel. First, what is a model master file? What are the key elements of it? Second, how to qualify a model master file? What is the process flow and who has the authority? Third, how to share a master file? Fourth, who to host the master file? With all these questions, I'm looking forward for further input from the panel. Thank you all for your attention and time.
It's my distinct pleasure to be able to contribute to this session and build upon what all other speakers so far talked about. This slide is just for records regarding my conflict of interest, as well as showing my disclaimer. And here is the menu for the next 12 minutes of what I'm going to talk about. Let me start by putting all the connectivities between what I had in the menu into a context. And I'm going to use this particular example to put things into context. Imagine you are moving to a new house with a garden, but when you arrive, you haven't got any lawnmower and you need to cut the grass. Of course, you can go and get a scissor and do everything manually, but the ideal situation is never to start everything manually or build a lawnmower from scratch. So you have got the option of going and actually getting a lawnmower, let's say borrowing from your neighbor. And you have got all these different scenarios. One, your neighbor gives you all the nuts and bolts and wheels and clogs and the different elements of the lawnmower that you are seeing in the left-hand side, and basically says, okay, go, and I have got all of these, and go and build your lawnmower. They can help you by additionally giving you a map that says that how you are going to put them together and what goes where. But the ideal scenario is always to get the master file, which is the combination of all those different elements with the right map that gives you the functional lawnmower. Of course, if you have got all the pieces, but the model map is not actually for those pieces, you can't put the things in a way that it gives you a functioning lawnmower. And also, when you have got the lawnmower, that doesn't mean that you are going to get the outcome that we are expecting and judging you at the end on the right-hand side, unless you know how this lawnmower actually functions. Therefore, adjustment of that lawnmower and making sure it is suitable to let's say first cut of the season or very short cut that you are having, and so on, that requires some level of also understanding and getting education for. We will talk about the approval process for the end result, which is the lawn in the right hand side of the previous slide later on, as well as the approval for the tools, which is the lawn mower. But let's just focus on the data and the separation of the systems data from drug data. These are explained in the reference that I have shown here. However, what has changed since 2012 is expansion in the pharmaceutics area, and therefore the change of the drug into not just the API, but the formulation elements defining various events like disintegration and deaggregation, solubility, dissolution, and so on. And the attribute of the physiology, when they combine with these, of course, will give us the overall outcome in this particular case, let's say bioavailability and the rate of absorption of the drug. But this requires different kind of data that we generate from experimental studies that we conduct. So the idea here is to change the philosophy and accept that what comes out of any specific system cannot be a predictive dissolution for all different drugs and formulations in all different conditions. However, to analyze such data in a way that we get the intrinsic values that they are associated for that particular drug and formulation, and then propagate via the physiology to all different conditions. Glancing through different kind of models from empirical to physiological indicates that the data that we are relying on when we move from the left-hand side to right-hand side starts to expand with regard to the system and physiology, while in the left-hand side models we are only relying on the observed data. And this is even more pronounced when we get into the systems biology models, that they contain huge amount of data that they are related to the system and nothing to do with that specific drug and formulation that we are investigating. I'm giving in this slide a typical example of the systems information that feeds into these kind of models. So you can see this for the dermal model, which involves sets of enzymes and transporters and so on, and it has nothing to do with the drugs that we are going to actually study. They are independent of that drug and can apply to any formulation and any drug. Hopefully with this background that I have given, now it becomes clearer that we are not talking about simple sets of equations that cobble together for the model master file, but we are talking about high-level hybrid integrated models that they contain lots of systems information. So the sponsors are responsible for not only the creation but continuous maintenance and enhancement of these models as the science progresses. Unless supported by government via public tax or via crowdfunding and charities, these are typically private companies that they are investing in these areas for financial benefit in a free market. And a typical example of this would be the case for the DDI simulator aspects of the SimSip that I have been involved with. And the key to success has been in collaboration between different stakeholders as defined in this particular piece in CPT editorial. Now, when it comes to beneficiaries, ultimate beneficiaries are patients who will have access to affordable, safe, and effective drugs faster. However, faster drug development means drug companies engaged with such activities are also going to gain financially. Many of these companies may not have internal capacity for use and application of these model master files. And therefore, they will be using consultants, whether as individuals or as firms, who are going to offer commercial services for this. Similarly, software companies who are providing these platforms, if successful in competitive market, they will be enjoying some financial gains. Last but not least, regulatory organizations, through streamlining the assessment process, will benefit because they don't have to go through every single submission of these kind of hybrid high-level models line by line. But we have to be very careful with mixing different roles that each of these beneficiaries play. And if the people who are producing these kind of model master files, they are also the people who are judging and approving, we will have some issues. There is a lot of talk about open source code models when it comes to systems biology and high-level models that so far we have been talking about. And the reference here gives you some statistics of the issues that they are related to these open source code models. In general, open sounds nice and positive. And many people take the academic angle for it, that they can go and play with it, see everything in it and so on. But if you look at it as a safe place for keeping your possessions, then you have to be calling it easily accessible and unsecure. Hence, you may decide to change the open source code to vulnerable to adulteration. The halfway house between black box that nobody can actually see what is inside the code and the open source code, which is vulnerable to changes inadvertently or intentionally, and therefore requires line by line assessment by the regulators when it is submitted, is the glass box approach, where there is a control over some elements in the glass box, in the green frame, and certain people have got the key to go and do those changes, but this is assessed only once by regulators, and the blue frame, where everyone can actually have access to those and change for the particular application that they are using the platform for. One of the consequences of having this approach actually has been a huge lateral expansion of the applications, and this is different than actually building the models as toys for big boys in the left hand side as you are seeing, but the purpose is actually to create modeling tools that they are for all, and they are of course driven by lots of licensed people who know how to drive from point A to B and put the car into an application, and many of them, they are actually field experts. All the data that we have got, and we have expressed as in this debate paper that I have put as a reference in this slide, they are indicating that over 3/4 of all the applications, they are actually using these high-level models that they are not open source code. And the numbers that's in industry and the numbers even in academia who are more engaged with research, again nearly 3/4. So the open source code, even it is needed for research, and in many of the academic centers they obviously rely on that to be able to add to new angles to any of the modeling that we are doing with the new data and so on. Still, now for applications they are relying on the non-open source code. And all the data that we have got in different application areas, they are supporting this. So all the data, as I said, it is counterintuitive to assume that the open source code is the, let's say, dominant modality of application of modeling and simulation. I will not dwell on this issue any further, and for those who are interested, I have put a link here regarding a 1-hour interview that I had in this particular issue that you can refer to and listen to the arguments there. For next couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about the issue of within subject variability in relation to virtual bioequivalence and the need for model master files. The audience of this particular workshop does not require any introduction to bioequivalence rules. Sufficient to say, not only we have to have the mean relative bioavailability within the acceptance interval, but also the confidence interval needs to be within that acceptance interval. Now, the issue arises when you are comparing one formulation against itself in occasion 1 versus occasion 2, and because of the within subject variability, they are going to show some variations, and hence the confidence interval may not be within that window. We cannot assume the interaction of every formulation with the system will end up with the same level of within subject variability. So a strategy that involves post hoc assignment of these within subject variability to the mean projection via physiological based pharmacokinetics or other means of the kinetic modeling, they are actually on false premise that this variability is going to be the same. The ideal situation would be to propagate the within subject variability to the PK based on known variabilities in physiology. However, the problem is within subject variability of the physiological parameters are not known from experimental studies that people have conducted on each of those elements. And the alternative in the best scenario is to assume the between subject variability as a conservative measure can replace within subject variability. Or, as we did in this study, to conduct a big matrix of these variables and see which one of them are compatible with observed within subject variability that we are seeing from bioequivalence studies. In short, once the verification is done for the average concentration time profile, we are playing with within subject variability of the physiology until we recover the observed within subject variability of the PK parameters in the clinical study that you are seeing in the left-hand side. And the right-hand side are the compatibility of different assumptions with regard to within subject variability in the physiology and the consequential PK within subject variability that we obtain against the actual data. Examining various sets, you end up with certain conditions which are completely incompatible with the observed within subject variation of PK parameters. Therefore, you can exclude such sets for the within subject variability of the physiology. Remember that this is nothing to do with the drug itself. However, because the drug and this particular formulation may not be sensitive to certain elements, you cannot exclude all different within subject variability and their possibilities. So although within subject variability of the physiology is independent of this drug and formulation, however, to be able to recover within subject variability of the physiology by looking at a certain drug and formulation, we can only exclude certain sets. And for rest of them, and narrow it down to the final set, we require different drugs and different formulations. And this is shown here by the sensitivity of this particular formulation and drug to different parameters. Now you may ask how this relates to virtual bioequivalence, and this is actually a projected bioequivalence study, a virtual bioequivalence study, and comparing with the real data. The left-hand side panel are showing the likelihood for the average bioequivalence based on two different assumptions for within subject variability, based on being equal to between subject variability at the top panel and equal to the best model that we had in the table that I showed earlier, and then comparing it with the actual observations. The middle panels, they are showing the likelihood for the upper limit of the confidence interval, and the right panel shows the likelihood for the lower end of the confidence interval. As you can see from the graphs at the top panel, it is possible that we may not pass the bioequivalence criteria according to the wrong within subject variability being inflated, and that is not compatible with observations. Now, the final question is that how this relates to the idea of model master file. And the way that I link it is that obtaining all these different values for the within subject variability, which are not related to a specific drug, as you have seen, it's not an easy task and requires lots of data analysis, comparing wherever possible with the experimental values and so on, and incorporating and updating them regularly. And incorporation of those into any module, therefore, it's going to be a costly affair. But once it is generated, that can be used by many different modelers without actually starting from scratch. I stop here and will take any questions during the panel discussions.
Good afternoon again, everyone. This is Liang. Dr. Don Major and myself are going to be the moderators. Before Don take over, probably I can introduce the new panelists, who haven't been introduced yet. So let me get the bios. And first of all, let me introduce Dr. Stella Grosser. She's the director of the Division of Biometrics 8 in the Office of Biostat Theater. And Dr. Hodjegan is the deputy director. He's currently acting director of the Division of Pharmacometrics, Office of Clinical Pharmacology, Theater, FDA. Dr. Viera Lukacova is a chief scientist at Simulations Plus Incorporation. Over the last decade, she has been contributing to the research in the area of mechanistic absorption and PBPK modeling, the development of GastroPlus, DDD Plus, and Membrane Plus software packages. Then Dr. Erik Sjögren. He is currently a senior consultant at Prometheus. He leads the PBPK quantitative system pharmacology platform, where he provides modeling expertise in the field of physiologically based PK modeling, QSP, and biopharmaceutics for prediction, translation, and analysis across all phases of drug development. Last, I think I want to introduce Dr. Lucy Fang. She has been introduced earlier. She currently serves as acting deputy director and the associate director of the Division of Quantitative Method Modeling, Office of Research Standard. That concludes my introduction of the new panelists. With that, I'll pass over to Dr. Don Major to moderate the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Liang. I'm honored to be serving as a co-moderator of this session. I think it'll be very exciting, and I'd like to start by thanking all of the speakers for their very thought-provoking talks. I think we should have a pretty lively discussion. Already we see some very interesting questions being posed in the chat box. So why don't we just get things started? I think I'd like to start with one of the very first issues that Liang brought up. I think we've had this clear case by Andrew for the need for model sharing, the fact that this is needed in order to advance the science and to do so in an efficient manner. We've heard about different types of models that are out there, as well as the challenges and opportunities that exist. So maybe I'll just kick off this question, and then we'll go across the panel. As we talked about earlier, just, if you want to chime in, just raise your hand. There's a little bit of a delay on the video, but I will definitely get to you for your response. The first question I propose then is, would you agree that the definition of the master model file should perhaps be independent of model type? And what would be the key elements or features of a master model file? So we're really trying to get at the definition of a master model file and what belongs in that. Maybe I could ask Viera to kick us off.
Thank you, Don, for giving me the first word, even though I'm going to borrow one of the early slides from Amin's presentation. I think if we do make the model master file completely independent of the model type, platform, and so on, it will be a pile of parts, right, which everybody needs to put together in the platform that they want to use, and it may or may not work depending on how skilled they are. If we want a model master file that is ready to use and is giving reproducible results, it will need to be specific to a model type, platform version, and the purpose for which it was built. So it is a balance between those aspects.
So yeah, so your definition would tie in the type, the version, the purpose as part of the definition of a master model file.
Yes, that is correct. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking for hands. Other panelists would like to. We're basically looking for what are the essential elements that you'd like to see, or what constitutes a master model file. Erik, perhaps you could comment.
Yes, I suppose it depends on the purpose. I mean, I guess it could be on a case-by-case basis. But I mean, as Liang pointed out, it would be nice to have all the verification within it also to be able to rerun things and see that it works. So that can also be an aspect that could be included. But I mean, it's I think it's still up to debate on what actually will be the complete master model file in the end.
Yeah, I think Andrew, you had your hand up next.
Sorry, I was trying to get on mute there. Yeah, I think that the purpose of the model is an intrinsic part of the master file. If it's going to contain modeling, verification, validation exercises, and data sets, then those activities always have to be conducted towards what the ultimate purpose of the model is. So without the purpose there being stated, the model master file won't have much of a definition then. So I think that's a critical element of it.
Yes, I completely agree that should be a component of it. Amin, I think I saw you next.
Oh, I was going to put it the other way around. What master file cannot be? I think a master file cannot be something that is not stable and it is modifiable in a way that, sort of, everybody has, let's say, possibility of changing some element of it. So whatever that we decide, sort of on whatever platform, whatever setup, let's say R code or whatever, at some stage, if we decide this is the master file, we have to actually block, sort of the elements that they are changing. So whatever we decide on any given platform, there are going to be elements that they can be changed. There are going to be elements that they cannot be changed. Therefore, any master file should have the possibility of actually locking some elements. Therefore, you can reuse without going back and reassessing it.
It's an excellent point. I think we're going to be coming back to, how do you maintain these things, right? How do you, how are we going to share? How are we going to maintain credibility and as the science progresses as well? So we'll probably come back to that concept as well. But for sure, it has to be a stable platform. There's no question. How I thought I saw your hand up earlier.
Sure. Thank you. I totally agree with what has been discussed. It really reminds me a fit-for-purpose program actually in our new drug site. That is a program similar to the concept of this, model master file, I would say. The program actually has been jointly hosted by OCP and OB, Office of Biostatistics. So in that setting, I would say, we wanted to have a clear definition for how this model is going to be utilized, what is the scope of the models, all those things are very the key components we want to put into it. On top of that, we also want to have some fixed model structure that has been clearly alluded in that model in documents. So we want to make sure we understand the key components will be there, and we have some technical details to ensure other people can use it. But in this case, I think a model master file probably will give us more details on the technicality portion on it also. I'm going to stop here and let others to weigh in also.
Thanks, Zhao. I think so. There's actually a question that was just posed that we could bring up, and I think it ties into the second question that I was going to discuss. There's a question. Suppose a master model file has been developed. How should it be updated in the face of new evidence and also in the face of scientific disagreements of the merits of such evidence or their interpretation? So it gives rise to the question, what criteria should go into validation? And then how should we go about considering the opinions, concerns of internal and external stakeholders? How should that be reconciled? Yep, Liang?
Yeah, probably I can just throw something that can stimulate some of the discussion. Really need everybody's input. I think for the model master file, we really don't want to make it the obstacle to constrain scientific freedom. So certainly, for example, if we have a model master file, it will more serving as a milestone achievement in the modeling field for a certain purpose. It itself is more like an organized summary of what has been achieved, what has been agreed upon, what has been accepted by the agency. Then certainly it doesn't stop the modeling advancement down the road. And with new data, with new knowledge, people can use it more like as a stepstone to further build another model. I think we should have that that guidance in mind. The other thing is if you have approach A to meet a regulatory requirement, we are not saying you can only use this model master file to meet the purpose. There could be other parallel pathways as well. So you can use the compartment model. You can use a mechanistic model to achieve the same purpose and meet the same regulatory need. Certainly, we don't want to make a model master file an obstacle. Certainly, with any new ecosystem, new concept, there will be new systems build up, new rules we need to follow. And I think that takes time. Today is just the first day we kind of roll out the concept, similar to a drug master file. Whether we are paying a fee or not paying a fee, I see a question in from the audience that the commercial developers have spent money investment to develop a model. How could they be willing to share that model without getting the a good return for the model development? I think those are all reasonable need and request. We also have Erik here, right? He's doing the open source development. That's why we invited him to share his opinion as well. So I think it's a very diversified, complex, and harmonious system we want to build in the future to meet every stakeholder's need and make the models and the scientists gain the maximum.
So I think Amin had his hand up. So Amin, did you want to address some of those comments?
I think actually Liang covered it. I just wanted to bring up for those areas that they are not, sort of settled. What happens with the platforms like, SimCip, let's say, we will have those as options that the user selects. Therefore, they are not part of the master file. Even they are in the system. Let's say, whether you want, the volume of distribution to be selected by Poland and, sort of Thiel, or whether it is Rogers and Roland, or whether you want, sort of another different model, for something else. Whenever they are not settled, they are options. Therefore, I don't consider that as part of the master model. That's the selection by the user, and that needs to be part of the assessment when it comes, to the FDA. But the rest of it that is already in place, of course, that is part of the master file and responsibility of the provider of the, the platform, rather than the people who are applying it.
Yeah, I think we're going to come back also to what do you do with these multiple versions that can happen over time. There's some great questions in the chat box we're going to get to in just a second. I think Stella, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I just had a few thoughts of analogies from statistical modeling and SAS programs, for example, where I'm thinking of something like ProcMixed, which started out informally being developed by users and enthusiasts, and now it's part of this commercial software. But to use it, you need to specify certain parameters that make sense for your situation, that capture the data and the model that you want within a wide, or not a fairly wide range of reasonable models. The other thing that, Hao mentioned, the Fit for Purpose initiative, we also have the Complex Innovative Design initiative coming out of new drugs. And again, that's not meant at this point for bioequivalence determination or this mechanistic kind of modeling, what I want to bring to the table is the idea there that there's a large regulatory and legal structure that's been put in place where sponsors will have their design basically approved ahead of time, and in return, and so they get that attention from the regulatory body, and in return they have to agree to disclose certain aspects, and it's very legalist. It's signed out in a contract, essentially a contract, but there's a system for doing this.
It's a great point, and I think we're going to be coming back to that point as well. How do we use the regulatory agencies or independent advisory committees or other mechanisms to watch after the quality control issue as versions come through? But it's a really good point. Yes, Amin.
I think on the back of the comments from Stella, we have to distinguish between sharing the model or master file versus sharing the code for the model. I think sometimes these two get sort of mixed up. sharing the model is what is already happening between many of whether the platform is commercial or non-commercial. Sharing the code for the model is a different matter. I fully agree that whoever is basically assessing it needs to actually know all the details, but at the same time, whoever mentioned the comment, with regard, to that, why, after spending 5, 6, 7 years of working out what the within subject variability structure should be for bioequivalence, that needs to be on the back of that, sort of investment available to whoever hasn't done any work on that. That is, sort of is unfair.
Yeah, I agree. I see that as not a roadblock, but as something that needs to be worked out in this context. The only other thing I wanted to throw out there was in terms of verification, validation. There is a large range of what's acceptable in the scientific community, the computing community, and I've seen it implemented in almost an amateur way, in a way that would not fly in a commercial software company, say. And again, it's a different context, but it's something to worry about.
Viera, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly follow up on a couple of last comments that Amin made. More of a question. So when we are talking about model master file, are we talking about a model master file for a specific drug product or a platform as a set of equations? Because the specifications here would be very different, right, as to what needs to be included in those models. Because I can have a very well defined and validated platform, right? And yet it is possible to build a really bad and completely useless model for a specific compound within that platform.
Because that was directed to my comment. I will clarify, Viera, but by saying that, to me, model master file is the platform, whatever that basically is not changed, plus any additional that particular the company sponsor has done, but we need to basically go and reuse it. Let's say you have created something for ketoconazole or whatever, and someone else wants to use that for a slightly different purpose. So many of those files, as you know, for the publications, that they become available, and other people, rather than building or rebuilding that from scratch, using or sharing the platform, they are also sharing the file that is associated with that work. So to me, combination of those two makes the model master file for me, for that particular purpose.
Erik, I saw your hand up.
Yes, so first of all, I would like to avoid this sort of argumentation around if the open source is sort of bad by default, because I mean there are processes to keep qualification and version control, I mean, so that it works, so that it's not an issue actually. But I think the point of sharing, I mean, actually I don't have anything against I mean proprietary selling things and everything, as long as that is sort of the case. I mean, it's fine. I'm not sort of promoting open everything, give everything for free. I'm not sort of a pirate in that way. But so in terms of sharing, I think it's very important to put the finger on what kind of sharing are we discussing here? Is it like free sharing of everything, or is it like sharing on the level that you can actually acquire it? Is it sharing of the verification data sets, so you know some other persons or entities know what was required to establish the sort of qualification? I mean, that is also something very valuable. It could be sharing, I mean, also many levels. So I think it's quite important that one establish what do we mean by sharing before we start to throw arguments all around. I mean,
it's a good point, Erik. I'd like to maybe come back to the concept of sharing, because there's a lot. You brought up a lot of great points as to the issues that we'll face when we try to share models. But I'm wondering if we've really defined yet what is a master model file. I see Lucy. Did you want to take that on? We can't hear you. I think perhaps you're muted.
Oh, yes. Can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Okay. I really want to go back to the point like Amin and Viera just pointed out. Well, I think we are talking about two kinds of model master file. One is the platform. For example, we have a disease modeling. For those kind of modeling platform, I think we really should be validated against a lot of products, a lot of drugs. So it's really independent. The purpose, how you are going to use that platform is independent of the drug product. And then the other platform I heard from what Amin just mentioned could be a specific product PBPK model, for instance, and the sponsor A use that model for one specific question. Sponsor B can take that same model to address a different question. If you, in this situation, you actually maybe contain some confidential information or some data. Actually, you need that data to fit that model. So, and then how you're going to validate that model, I think it's going to be really catered towards the purpose of your why you are building the model. So I think we have to differentiate these two types of model master file. That I think that's my point, because the whole evaluation process, validation, verification are going to be very different.
It sounds to me like it's becoming more and more specific to a specific application and what has been submitted, perhaps. And then the master file is tied to that submission, and perhaps then you have to be able to completely reproduce, perhaps, what went into that submission with a validated master file, right? So it becomes very specific, perhaps, to that submission. I want to bring up a question that came from the chat box that I think goes to some of the issues that might come up with the definition of a master model file. Is that if there is a master file and it is allowed to be modified, then there will be several versions, and each sponsor can claim their file is better or includes confidential information, parameters that make it more reliable. So what will be the master file? I guess it can be a base model file rather than a master model file. So it starts to, I think, get complicated when you start to think about modifications and then having several versions of that out. Are we going to call a master model file one that has been validated for a very broad purpose? Or I think what I'm hearing is it has to be very specific. And then how will we handle then modifications or versions as the science evolves? Yeah, Amin.
I think you were going to, I think, discuss, sort of acceptability at some stage, but I think it is actually important to bring on the back of this question that, when somebody actually changes something and claims this is better, whether we are going to accept that, against the previous one or so. I would say the acceptability is not on the back of just one presentation or one publication. We know even in the publication case, maximum 2 reviewers they are going to look at and get that published if they can agree on. And in many cases, versus, either, by mistake or sort of not knowing the field, they may actually omit some of the aspects that they could have looked at. So the acceptability of the model on the back of just changing one parameter and saying that, oh, this is working better, that is not the case. In majority of the case, as I know, majority of cases that I know in FDA, they needed 7-8 external, sort of independent applications before they get comfortable. I'm not talking about, having 100%, confidence, just getting comfortable. They need 7-8. So whoever is changing something and saying, oh, this is better, they have to provide the same level of evidence that this is in 7-8 cases. Unfortunately, over the yesterday and today, I have seen cases that, drug parameters were changed between the control release and an immediate release. Even there are drug parameters inside the body. How you can do that? But obviously somebody has actually done it, and I'm not going to go into details of it. So it is, I think, it is important that we have got the same rigor with regard to when something is changing and say, oh, this is working for this case. That should cover all the other cases to become what you basically consider as a general master file. Or you can call it master file, 3-star, master file 2-star, 1. I don't know how you are going to score it, but a true master file, I think it would be very difficult, just to change one parameter and say, oh, it's better. You have to go through all those previous validations that you had.
Thanks, Amin. I saw Liang, your hand was up to maybe address some of those.
Yeah, I think Erik raised hands earlier than me. I will give the chance to Erik first.
Very good.
So I'll just tag along with on Amin's point here. I mean, if you're talking like drug input parameters, for instance, just in a simple case, I mean, there may be so that there is a specific input that was sort of, I don't know, estimated with some prediction tool and used in the qualification, but then some sponsor actually measured that value and want to include that and then rerun the whole qualification package with that parameter, then I think it's and show that it works, basically, obviously, then I think it's a valid sort of update to the model master file. I mean, if one can sort of see that it actually works with this measured value, for instance, that's an example.
Yeah, I can potentially. I also see in partially addressing the questions from Dr. Jamei from the audience. I think people still, along with the question whether we can have different versions of a model master file. I think they, to me, actually, when we first think about the concept, those questions come to in mind. Things the first meeting. So I think that what is a model master file is worth probably advisory committee meeting itself. But I think it could be very complex. But I think one distinct feature of a model master file is it has gone through peer review, most preferably by the FDA reviewers, and get the acceptance has made impact. Then for the next version, even though it's maybe more advanced, more scientifically solid, but if it hasn't gained the recognition yet, then we still need like Amin said, need to go through another round of scrutinization from the peers, from FDA reviewers, and to justify for the use and the purpose. If that's the case, then we can certainly, here is an upgraded version of a model master file. The previous one is outdated and it can be obsolete. But having said that, I will imagine that for the model master files, they could have a very diverse relationships. Say for model master file A could be a parent of another model master file for a different purpose. Or a model master file just is a subset, a component of a larger master file with a more overall purpose. So I think that will be various relational things we need to figure out. But however, if a file has been accepted and has been recognized by the community for a certain purpose, and then we have the best practice to use that model for that purpose, and then it can be a master file. Certainly, we haven't talked about the question about who has the authority to stamp on the file to say it's a model master file. At this point, I think we can start from very simple. If it has made a regulatory impact, then that's the basic landmark model master file for regulatory purpose. Then I will say it's been justified as a master file. just my input. I think Dr. Peck also kind of brought up there are 16 disease progression models has been published, put online by the FDA, whether that we can consider as a master file that can serve as a benchmark for new treatment, for new intervention margin, that certainly needs further discussion as well. So, but I think it's going to be, we need to be clear, but we also need, in the same time, recognizing it's a complex ecosystem.
Well, I think there's some questions in the chat box going right down to the basic definition. They're asking, what do you mean by file? It's a master model file, right? So I mean, it is a digital file, I presume, that would be opened in the platform in which it was generated, and thus allowing you then to do the analysis, do the simulation that could be compared to perhaps what has been submitted with whatever it's accompanying, right? Whether it's, whatever application has been submitted to a regulatory agency. But the master file should be able to be, digitally opened within whatever package was used to create it. And then you can accurately reproduce the elements of the submission. And then that I think helps to appreciate what must be in it, right? You can debate other components of it as well. Should that include data, right? I think there was a question, do we also need to define the data that goes into such models? And I'll come back to that model or that question in just a moment. But are we starting to get closer to an appreciation for what is a master model file? I mean, you're absolutely right, Liang. We're going to have to come to, whether it's an advisory committee or the FDA does it themselves, they're going to put a stamp on it to say this is a master model file. But here we're talking about the definition, of a model file, right? Do we have
just share just with within 30 seconds, I will give a chance to others. I think the model master file should encompasses different types. Some files do need the data to support. Some files don't. For example, for the B evaluation approach, the two one-sided t-test approach, right? It's just a model. It's just a statistical approach, and it can be applied to different data sets. And it doesn't need to come with the data, but conceptually, it could be a package that could be used, shared again and again. But for some PBPK models, say there's a commercial software package, and like for a dermal local biodistribution simulation, there are so many physiological parameters. There's dynamic setups. You need to qualify the platform, and you need to use large data set to qualify the platform. If you need the FDA to always recognize the commercial software package, right? You certainly have a large data set to support the qualification of the platform. And those data sets need to be part of the master file. However, not every applicant do not need to gain the information access to that data set. Since the data has been previously reviewed and accepted, then for proprietary information that commercial companies being considered, then certainly you can say the platform has been previously accepted by FDA. For this purpose, you can use the platform. Then we at FDA, if we have reviewed the platform already, we do not need to repeat the process again. And but the applicant can still use the platform. That's, we do have a diverse, we need to have a diverse set of master file depending on the scope and the purpose. Just my, it's not an official opinion, it's just my personal 2 cents.
So who should be? Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Amin.
Unfortunately, Carl is not here, but honestly, I find sort of the way that he was describing and Liang picked up on the two-sided test for bioequivalence, not requiring any master file. To me, that is just a model. The fact that we are talking about not model sharing, but we are talking about model master file sharing. To me, this is actually distinguishing that we are not talking about just a one-coded, two-coded model. We are talking about something that is bigger, which contains many, many pieces. It's like going back, my lawnmower case. If you are just talking about, one wheel of the lawnmower, you don't need all of the discussion. You just basically get that wheel and get on with whatever you are doing. If you wanted to borrow the scissor, just, that's a scissor. But when it is more complex and it has got many components, we get into this trouble of ability to define, what elements is, the master file, what element isn't, what element. So to me, going back to your question, Don, whether it will include data or not, I will say that if it doesn't include data, we are, wasting our time here talking about just, few differential equation. No, that's not the case. To me, when we need master file, that means that, we are into the, let's say, arena of big set of data, whether they are drug related, whether they are system related, and so on.
Yeah, I think the case is, I think there's the case that these master model files are really needed for the more complex systems models that we're talking about, PBPK, QSP, and the like. Carl is with us, and Carl, do you agree with that? I mean, we're probably not looking at master model files for, say, exposure response or population PK. Did you want to comment on what Amin had brought up?
Oh, he has been very quiet. Sorry, I didn't see you.
He's here.
No problem, Amin. Yeah. Well, I've been having a little trouble getting my arms around what what domain we're actually discussing here. But if it's physiologically based modeling, there could be a grandmaster file that includes all organs and all tissues and all transfer parameters that then could be flexibly input by the user. That's what I would consider to be sort of a mega master file. If the product is a transdermal, then of course it might be more limited to the to the skin, although the skin's connected to the body and the body's going to do something with that product once it gets in. So I did want to bring up one aspect that hasn't been discussed so far, and that's user friendliness. It seems to me if we want uptake and traction by the user community, it can't be so obscure like non-mem was in its early days that no one can actually use it. So some kind of standards for usability, perhaps even a framework, a preferred set of user-friendly properties should accompany the the guidance with respect to proposal and acceptance and utility of a master file.
Yeah, I agree, Carl. I mean, I think your point about expertise being a challenge for all of this, I think it's the whole basis for why we're talking about master model files is to sort of help address that very concern you're bringing up. I completely agree. Maybe we can turn to sharing, and maybe I'll ask Erik to maybe chime in on that component. I know he's passionate about that. But by what mechanism should master model files be shared, and with whom?
Yeah, so as I previously said, I think it depends on which level of sharing we are talking about. I mean, if it's a file that needs a platform to be executed, that I don't see why the provider can't sort of keep track on that and have a repository for that, or the agency could also have that if they have like a want to keep the repository. But I mean, if it's, I mean, one can also see like if it's data, I mean, big databases, then one that is shared, then one could see other possibilities as well. So I think it's dependent on which level we're talking about sharing basically. So, but I mean, version control and things like that, that can be, I mean, completely regulated and the processes for that. So there's no issue around that. And one in reporting, I mean, then it's regular QC matters. I mean, you also always QC what you do, and that is so that goes back to the quality control that you use and the model as you should.
Yes, I was just going to ask Stella, please.
Hi, I just wanted to go back to one of the earlier points that Liang made in his talk, which is we want to have we have an analogy between the model master file and the drug master file, and I wonder, and I don't know enough about it to carry that analogy further, but I wonder if that's a useful approach here in terms of sharing and the business model and so on.
Yes, Andrew.
I say one of like the concepts that kind of borrow from the drug master file is that, you know, the drug master file allows that sort of communication between like the API manufacturers, starting material manufacturers, and the FDA, and sort of the firms who are going to be using that get cut out of that proprietary information, which the API manufacturers may not want to share. So one aspect of the sharing is essentially, you know, more talk, more communication between the model developers and the FDA. Not to say that doesn't happen already. We meet a lot. We have a lot of interactions, even through contracts and grants and development. But when it comes to, that's more a bit on the research side. When it comes to actually pushing forward things for, you know, regulatory usage, there may need to be some additional avenue there. And then the second aspect of the sharing is then being able to share this knowledge to the applicants. I'm thinking more from the generic industry standpoint, which may not have a lot of critical data necessary or cannot conduct just more and more in vivo studies to get out of a vivo study. It's, you know, they're the ones that can then benefit from all this additional knowledge and have confidence in utilizing these type of tools in order to then, as I go back to my presentation, that ultimate goal, you know, getting out, I mean, doing less human testing. That's always a positive thing, and you know, getting more products on the market. So that's where I see the two type of sharing that could be going on.
Yeah, to me, the model master file has another function. It's as the communication tool. So I think even though a model has been accepted, say from one company, say to replace one in vitro experiment or in vivo experiment that's needed for a generic application, or even in the new drug side, there are some model approach being used for certain purpose, but the generic drug side is not aware of it. Or the generic drug side has accepted the model for a certain purpose, but the generic new drug side is not aware of it. Even within the agency, that potentially can happen. I think the model master file, another function is serve as a communication tool. In that case, we need to have a mechanism to make the field be aware of such utilities. You know, a model has been accepted for a certain purpose. I'm wondering, you know, FDA can certainly broadcast. I don't think we have a current function except for publishing the reviews. But the reviews is more like there are a huge amount of information. So need people to dig out the information they need. However, do you all think that in a journal, in the modeling field, we can have a subsection, or even from some of our association that we can have a subcommittee just, summarize, the modeling impact of accepted models in the field, and then share the information to the community as a whole. Just wondering what the panel thinks about that.
Yes, Amin.
My experience with that, Liang, is that the key is not the actual file. So what you are talking about, let's just give an example, is that, drug A is with a model, with let's say PBPK, is submitted to OCP, and they have agreed with all the elements for that intended purpose. It has worked. And now we want to see how that can be used in the generic later on. The problem with publishing that master file, when it comes, to majority of the journals these days, is a mandatory. If you are actually putting something to them, it needs to come with the executable file that you have to actually submit as well. The problem with that in the FDA would be that if they have got specific drug parameters that they don't want to publish, and they haven't actually informed others, whether it is, solubility, whether it's, sort of, I don't know, affinity against certain transporter, whatever else, if that is part of that, master file, I think they will have a problem with, publishing that, and you need a redacted version of that file, which I don't know how that works.
The dancing around the proprietary information, I think is always something we need to pay attention on the legal aspect. However, I think if the utility, we can deduct some of the proprietary information, but sometimes you can just, the master file is about a routine, a practice, a best practice, rather than a product. It could be. Sometimes it could be just about a product as a whole, and it can be extrapolated to other products. In that way, then the product information can be also included. It could be just a best practice. This model, by changing which parameter, and even though drug A is different from drug B, but they are having the same issue, have the same regulatory need. You just change the physiological parameter for drug A to drug B. I'm just trying to simplify the situation. I think that will gain good benefit to the industry.
I think I'm going to throw in my 2 cents just why not? I feel like if it's a journal, though, I think if you were trying to work through a journal, it would really have to be a different type. Maybe we have a journal, but it has a different approach to doing this sort of thing, because I think a lot of this will get lost if in our current journal practices. It almost seems like we need to have an independent agency, or perhaps or organization or society, or perhaps again using the advisory committees that are available to FDA to really review these and to coordinate perhaps sharing, etc. I don't see this being an effective exercise through journals, just publication. I don't know what the other panelists think.
I agree.
Me as well.
I see from the audience, from Dr. Robert Bies, he said perhaps something like a Drupal TYR notebook or R Markdown type of repository. I think that kind of in line with what you are talking about.
Yeah. I mean, there are certainly a number of repositories, and there are many of them out there. One is biomodels, for example. And I think I haven't looked into them in quite some time, but I think that type of platform does require a bit of validation that file that you're submitting has to be able to reproduce, let's say, the figures that went into the publication. So there's a lot of curation and quality control that goes into that. And I think wherever it would be housed, whether it's at the FDA or independent agency, I think a lot of care would have to go into watching a lot of these very important points that have been brought up by the panelists as well as some of the folks asking questions. So, you know, the platform like an R Markdown and these types of repositories are a great idea, only if, though, there's a high level of quality control that you know, in order to provide some credibility to the whole process. In my opinion,
the quality control done can be regulatory acceptance. If the master file is mainly named for regulatory purpose, then the regulatory acceptance could be a benchmark to qualify a master file, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Got a thumbs up from Carl.
We reached some agreement.
It's nice to reach some agreement towards the end of the conversation. Other questions, or I don't think we've had others submitted just yet.
Viera had something to say.
Yeah, I have just a quick question then to the last comment that Liang made, that if regulatory acceptance, and I completely agree with it, that if regulatory acceptance is the marker, would this come from the regulatory agency? Would it be the regulatory agency that would say that, hey, we've reviewed this file, we've liked it, it could be used as a master file? Or would that be dependent on the submitting company or the sponsor company, with them volunteering that, hey, you know, FDA reviewed this, it could be used as a master file? Who would indicate, who would initiate that process of qualifying or marking something as this is a master file?
Yeah, you triggered the next good question, Viera. You know, what would be the operational aspect of having a model master file? We talked about what is model master file and what's the type and you know, how to share and what the qualification. Then what the operational side of it. You know, if who should make the call and who should have the stamped, and should that be a panel between FDA and the industry, or some industry people, or just purely FDA people? You know, or you know, what's everyone's opinion in terms of the operational side of the equation?
I've been waiting for Amin to ask the question, what happens when FDA makes the master file?
No, I was trying to actually answer the question because it is related, you know, sort of to this particular discussion, that what gap master file is trying to actually to fill in. The gap it is trying to fill in is the repeat, unnecessary repeat, I will say repeat of the same thing again and again. This is waste of time for everybody. And particularly for the regulators, that they have to go through the same thing, you know, that is, you know, coming in a different shape or form. While if it is already is actually decided, and as Liang said, sometimes, you know, one arm of even FDA may not know the other arm, you know, sort of has already agreed. So they if this is announced in the way that Viera is referring to, by whoever, whether it is FDA, whether the sponsor itself or whatever, then this becomes known that this particular application of this kind of model has been accepted as a master file. So it is basically saving time for everybody, whether it is assessment, whether actually building the model, whether applying the model in a wider space, etc., etc.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it also level the playground for the industry, for the like smaller size companies. They know there are some other means to meet the regulatory purpose. The other thing is certainly, as you said, is to increase the regulatory consistency as well. Once it's announced, accepted, then, you know, there's a consensus across the board, and that will reduce the inconsistency in terms of recommendations as well.
Yeah, I think.
If I may, you know, on your previous question, just, you know, because now people are intrigued what you meant by, you know, the question I was going to ask. The debate and discussion also we had, you know, as part of the panel before, that what happens actually, the FDA colleagues make the master file. And this is part of the discussion. In that case, and that hence my warning during my actually presentation, you can't have FDA both as a creator of the file as well as an approver. In those cases, I fully agree with Don that you have to have definitely external people coming in, advisory board, etc., and looking into what actually FDA has done.
Thanks, Amin. Stella, I saw your hand up.
Well, I was just going to quickly say that there's again, for new drugs, there's a qualification mechanism for things like biomarkers and clinical outcome assessment scales, and there's a third, I can't remember. So again, there might be an analogy, something useful there that's already been established. That's purely FDA committee that, of people with expertise.
Absolutely. Carl, I saw your hand up.
Yes, there are many aspects of what we've been talking about that are unresolved. And what I wondered is there a lead model that that we could agree upon should be sort of experimented with in the sense that okay, let's make a master file and let's qualify it and let's see how to use it. Is there a particular gap that would be solved by a master file, but benefit the industry and benefit patients that one could get started on? That's for you, Liang.
Oh, that's for me. Dr. Peck, I think it sounds like a very complex process concept that we do not have a good hand on it. But actually, we can start from simple cases. Certainly the benefit, in addition to the benefit you mentioned, I think certainly the will, as mentioned earlier, will increase regulatory consistency as well. So for a model that's been accepted by the one review arm in the agency, we can certainly think about how it's here as well. Think about to form a coordination group in terms of sharing the models that have made significant regulatory impact, and then figure out a mechanism to certainly within the working group, as Stella's also here as well. So then we can have some consensus on how to coordinate the future reviews and how to make a general benefit of the accepted practice to all the industry. And we can certainly negotiate with a journal, for periodically publish the thought as a way of communication, or have a subcommittee in an organization. That's the functionality is to download to the community what have been recognized, what have happened. That's some preliminary thinking, Dr. Peck. Did I address your question? Let me know if I'm not.
Well, you answered a slightly different question, I think. I just wondered, we need practice, we need experience with an example master file. So, is there a lead application that comes to mind that we can work out some of the kinks?
Yeah, I think 2-3 years ago, we proved a topical product, which is diclofenac topical gel, where a PBPK modeling generated virtual simulation data has been used in the place of conducting an in vivo clinical endpoint B study. I think that created, I should acknowledge that it created some potential controversies as well. However, I think the controversy is mainly caused because there's a lack of overall understanding of the review package. For example, the PK profile are almost overlapping. Then internally, we also have conducted sensitivity analysis to test out all the risk failure modes. What if it was built from a bottom-up model? Certainly, the simulation is not 100% matching with the observation. However, if we want to make the curve match with observation, so we have to change some of the parameters. So we have evaluated by changing the parameters, to match with the observations, what the risk associated with. By changing the parameters, we'll see a bio-inequivalent scenario. We didn't. However, all those practices have not been made publicly very transparent to the outside. That creates lots of questions. When people say, "Oh, your simulated curve is not matching with observed concentrations," therefore, how are you guys trying to have a relaxed standard in this particular product? Certainly, we can package that, regulatory review, internal process into a package, make it routine by sensitivity analysis when you see this and that, and then it can potentially apply to another product, and that could potentially serve as a master file. We certainly have other cases where, as presented this morning, the B space for the in vitro testing parameters can be informed by PBPK modeling. So a master file could be the purpose to justify a deviation from in vitro testing. So if that's been accepted, actually there are some accepted cases. Other companies, if they think, okay, there's a slight pH change between formulation A and formulation B. Previously, there's one case that you use the PBPK model to justify that such marginal pH change, even though it failed the Q3 critical quality Q3 parameter assessment, but kind of being bridged by a modeling, then we can share that practice. It could be another type of master file. Certainly, I'm limiting my cases into PBPK modeling. There could be other things, like I use a hypothetical case that the one-sided t-test can be a master file, which being criticized by Amin. I accept the criticism. I think it shouldn't be a master file. It's just, can create some bureaucracy unnecessarily. However, I'm just using that as a case that could be hypothetically similar to other cases where you do not need a data product, where a modeling approach can be routinely used for a certain purpose. That's something, that could represent other types of model master files.
So, Liang, I thank you for that response. And I think we have to move towards closing remarks. Unfortunately, the discussion has been so exciting, but I think that the case has been made, I think, clearly for the need for a master model file. But at the same time, I think this discussion has brought up a lot of considerations to go forward. I agree with Carl. It'd be great to have an example, something to help us go through a workflow and begin to understand what master model files are and how they could be used. But this discussion has been fantastic. I want to thank all of the speakers and the panelists for their contributions, and of course all of the attendees as well. As you pointed out, we weren't going to solve it all, but I think we did make the case, and then I think we've pointed a way towards some of the considerations that need to be addressed as we go forward. So I thank everybody, and I'm going to turn this back to Jim as we prepare for closing remarks. Thank you, everyone.